a lot of people are really, spurring up. And this is, going on well prior to that. And community engagement. Folks really wanted to be engaged more and have a better understanding of really how the city processes worked. So, in Boston, one of the big things that they were able to kind of create was a civic academy, really taking, volunteers or residents, I should say, through this process of meeting their elected officials, understanding what it means to go to City Hall and advocate for issues, primarily the domain areas. Next slide, please. So that takes us to, how are we really supporting the efforts? Obviously, we believe in making a difference. So one of the important things was, looking at the numbers, really supporting the efforts. So one of the things that I believe ARP and Tufts and a few different partners were involved in was really helping to get the word out to residents, using our collective abilities and powers to bring folks to the table. One of the biggest accomplishments on the early stages was really listening, getting those residents there. Obviously 3,000 respondents to a survey is not always, it's difficult to accomplish, I will say that. And then obviously another piece is noticing the 70 organizations that were represented, and this is just in the city of Boston itself. So really taking stock of who's at the table. Other things that we were able to do were, support funding, again, for those low-hanging fruits. So looking at your parks, public spaces, helping to fund outdoor exercise equipment. And then there were a few communities who actually started to look at specific initiatives, primarily accessory dwelling units. We all hear about housing and the need and want for more housing stock or housing options. So accessory dwelling units became a big talking point early in our process. So that's, when several organizations joined up and, again, provided the expertise, the knowledge, and potentially funds to really bring people to the table. Next slide, please. And this is I think one of the most important pieces in the early stages of age-friendly was really identifying the age-friendly leadership. Identifying those people who were at the table. I think the typical model when people hear about age-friendly, it's just your elected officials and your city staff who would be at the table, who are leading these initiatives. But what we actually saw throughout this process was that several communities were looking at it beyond that. They were looking at it as the volunteers were at the table. Your health and human services folks were being brought into the conversation. Your council on agings were being invited. Regional planners, chamber of commerce, all of these aspects of our communities that we only go to for specific reasons were now being asked to join this larger conversation and really create that idea of community as a whole, and how could we progress this age-friendly initiative moving forward. And most importantly, I think, were the statewide partners who spurred up and who were kind of in behind the scenes watching this process as it moved forward. So, really identifying the Tufts Health Plan Foundation, who was really creating opportunities to support communities' ideas on how they would like to move the initiative forward with their momentum funds. The Council on Aging's, really connecting the senior centers, being that central hub for the community centers, spreading out information to all 300 and X number of communities, senior centers across the state here in Massachusetts, and bringing them to the table and letting them know that the Council on Aging is a support for them. Then we have the educational side of it. We have several universities here in the state who have also taken an interest. Some people say universities are kind of their own entities, but in our case, UMass Boston and several other universities raised their hand as saying, yes, we are a part of the community and we would love to help move this initiative forward, provide our expertise. They're bringing students into the community, so help to make them be a part of the community. And then at the state level, we have the Executive Office of Elder Affairs. really bringing in that voice of what does it look like at the state level? What can the state gain or hear from its residents, from its communities, and how can they move initiatives forward that will help support the overall work that we're doing? And then there's the Massachusetts Healthy Aging Collaborative, who is bringing together partners, all of the various organizations that we have across the state, having that hub with the Massachusetts Healthy Aging Collaborative was huge, because they brought in several organizations, gathered us, and really created that opportunity and that synergy for moving the initiative beyond where it was in 2014 with 3 communities. Next slide, please. And that brings us to today. We have about 70 communities that have joined the network. I think we have about another 60 to 70 that are interested in the network. And the way these communities have joined are in various ways. Some have joined in as single entities. Others are joining in as regions. And that just shows that this age-friendly process can be, what it is. There is no right way of doing it. We all know every community is different. Neighboring communities have their own voice, and that's the way this initiative has proceeded here in Massachusetts. But there is that same underlying notion that we all want to create a state, a community that's great for people of all ages. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who can kind of really talk on how the state moved this initiative beyond where it was, where we got to with this.
Thanks, Antron. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. As Jeff said, I work for the state's aging agency, which in Massachusetts is called the Executive Office of Elder Affairs. And it's been part of my responsibility and really a great privilege and joy to be the person in the public sector leading this age-friendly work. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the state's role and how that role evolved and how it connects to what Antron talked about, as well as what you'll hear about from James in a few minutes. So if you could roll forward with the slide, that would be great. So while all that work was going on in communities that Antron shared, the early adopting communities were out there doing their thing. Some of us were in our governor's office having meetings with him and his team about what it means for our state to grow older. And in 2017, the governor signed an executive order and created a council to address aging in Massachusetts. And I know that sometimes it's hard to see slides when you're on Zoom like this. So let me just read you this quote because I love it. And I still, 3 or 4 years later, find it very inspirational. He said, "We need to think differently about aging in Massachusetts. This isn't just about acknowledging a shift in demographics. It's about being intentional in our planning to ensure that those who grew up here, who raised families and built communities, can continue to contribute their energy, experience, and talents where they live and make Massachusetts the most age-friendly state." So he after signing this executive order, we swore in a council. It's 24 people. And the thing I want to point out to you about the council is that these were 24 individuals from all different domains and sectors. I would say that fewer than half of them were experts in what we might call the aging field. So we had folks from technology, from education, from financial services, from transportation, and from housing. And that turned out to be really key to the kinds of recommendations we came up with and the kind of success that we've had. And just to keep the story clear, about a year after the council was formed, the governor did commit for Massachusetts to become an age-friendly state, and we were the second state in the country to do so. Next slide, please. So what do you do with a council of 24 people who don't necessarily know each other and who don't necessarily know a lot about aging? Well, we took it on the road, and we started by listening. We held listening sessions across the state, and not just in big cities. We literally went to the far corners of the state, and we heard from about 500 individuals, and we very simply asked them questions about what it's like to be growing older in their community. What works, doesn't work, What are you concerned about? What do you think the opportunities are? And the council members all showed up to listen. So sometimes we were in a crowded conference room. I know that's hard to imagine today. We were in a crowded room with 8 or 12 or 14 council members at the front, and literally 100 or 200 people in the audience waiting to talk. It was really a wonderful experience. Next slide. And overwhelmingly, what we heard from people was that they really wanted to age in their community. And at the time, housing and transportation were very much at the forefront of what was on people's minds. I think if you were to start this listening tour today, you might hear some different things. My hypothesis is that technology might replace where transportation is. People are very focused on how technology can help them connect right now, and whether they have access to affordable broadband and internet, or the skills or the hardware to really leverage technology. But given the themes we heard a couple of years ago, the council created 5 work groups to dive deep into certain areas. And those areas were housing, transportation, family caregiving, employment, because we heard that there was great concern about economic security, and people wanted to work not only for their economic well-being, but for their emotional health, and to have a sense of purpose and a reason and way to participate. And then we had a 5th group on innovation and technology. Next slide, please. We also needed a framework to guide our deliberations. And we spent a lot of time thinking about what a framework might look like. And interestingly enough, we did not choose a public health framework, which I know many states have done, including New York. But rather, we thought that a social justice framework made more sense given what our aspirations were and given what we thought some of the challenges would be. So in a social justice framework, we have community, those little people in the middle. Community is what it's all about. That's the focal point. That's the unit of analysis. We looked at everything through a lens of access, equity, and inclusion, and we focused on key areas like economic security, accessibility of services, underscoring the importance of connection and engagement, and age-friendly communities. And our aspirations weren't crazy, but 3 years ago, they felt pretty bold. You know, to say 3 or 4 years ago, every community, when there were only about 6 at the time, will become age-friendly was a bold aspiration, but it really helped guide our work. Some of the other aspirations that seem particularly bold, but seem to be bearing fruit, are, one of them is we had envisioned, we aspired that Massachusetts would be the Silicon Valley of innovation and aging, and that we would export knowledge and services to other parts of the country. We also had this aspiration that we would proactively talk about people planning for a 100-year life. And sure enough, those things have started to happen. Next slide, please. One of the earliest recommendations from the council was that we join the AARP network of age-friendly states and communities. We were the 2nd state in the country to join, the 1st in the country to create an action plan, and we also have our 1st-year progress report, which I know we will have posted and share with you. And we were only able to make the commitment to do this work because of the amazing partners that we have. Antron has mentioned several of them, and you can't quite read them in the middle frame on this slide, but we have partners from the public sector, the private sector, academia, philanthropy, and so forth. And I would just suggest to you that this work is really rewarding, but it's also joyful to work with so many people who are aligned and focused on getting to the same place. And you might ask, well, why did you need an age-friendly plan if you had communities doing this work on their own? And I think we felt that there was a role for the state as a facilitator to bring this work to every community, to scale best practices, to knock down barriers, and to coordinate how certain issues were approached. And there were some areas which really couldn't be addressed by communities alone. And the example that comes to mind for me is the issue around ageism and transforming the language that we use around aging and caregiving. Next slide, please. So we call our plan Reimagine Aging. And it is not a set of rules or mandates for local communities. Our plan is really built from community up. And we acknowledge, and one of our deeply held principles is that communities should approach this work in whatever way makes sense. We don't have an ideology, we don't have a rule book. You could start with age-friendly, you could start with dementia-friendly. You can work in any domain, you can work on any issue. Our view is that there are many on-ramps to this highway, and we are happy for cities and towns to take whatever on-ramp makes sense to them. So our vision really is that aging is reimagined in Massachusetts, and we have 6 goals in our state plan that are broad goals. They're not about the domains per se, they really cut across the domains. And those are to spread this work across more communities, to make sure there's a way to share information about what's going on in communities, to tackle some of the problems about how aging is framed and the language that is used, to look at how we embed aging in all policies and practices, to improve the economic security of older adults, and to create some mechanisms so that this work can be sustained beyond any single group of leaders at the local, state, or community level. Next slide, please. And this slide just shows you that there were just many, many, many inputs to the state plan. There were inputs from state commissions on issues relevant to older people, such as LGBTQ aging. There was input from Dementia Friendly Massachusetts, et cetera. Next slide, please. So we just released our year 1 progress report. We were a little bit late because of our friend the coronavirus, but we're thrilled that we were able to complete it. It's actually really great reading. I would encourage you all to look at it. There's everything from what we did in the report is we documented all the steps we took against the 6 initiatives. And so you can see specifics and you can get ideas about how you might adopt some of these things in your own community. We also have a way for you to contribute and share your ideas with us so that we can leverage and adapt some of your best thinking. Next slide, please. And what I want to leave you with this morning is that there are benefits that we could not have predicted. We could not have predicted how critical our age-friendly work would be during this pandemic. What we're realizing now is that the age-friendly infrastructure we have created is part of the secret sauce in communities and how communities respond and how they interact with their residents. The work helped communities respond to COVID-19 and created channels of communication and relationships that we've all needed to leverage over the last 6 months. The other thing that has been very important to us is that the investment we made early on in understanding older adults' priorities and that individual communities made in understanding older adults' priorities has been beneficial in the pandemic because we really know what matters to us. And then the final thought I'll leave you with is that a strong age-friendly commitment makes the whole community stronger. Communities that have made age-friendly commitments have certainly benefited during this period since they're able to understand and anticipate their community needs. They know who their stakeholders are, and they really are able to help support resilience and recovery. So I want to turn this over to James with the thought that I don't think the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is in charge of all this. We are really a facilitator and a leader. But really the backbone of this work is seated in the Massachusetts Healthy Aging Collaborative, which is very deliberately not a government entity. It is a privately organized organization with a very, very broad membership, and it is largely supported through philanthropic funding. So let me turn it over to James and have him talk a bit about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robin. And kind of to talk about our role in all of this. So just to pick up on where Robin left off, you know, you've kind of heard a number of times that we don't really have a lot of rules and we're not too rigid about anything, but the only thing we really say as a rule, our closest thing to a rule, is that you listen to communities, and that, you know, this process is about kind of making this real and making it relevant for all of our cities and towns. So in Massachusetts, just to back up a half step, we have 351 very different, very independent cities and towns. and something that we don't have in the slides, but is immensely important, is the fact that the Tufts Health Plan Foundation supported UMass Boston with creating a healthy aging data report that has some statewide statistics on everything from behavioral health to social determinants of health and other things. But every community, you can go on our website and just Google Mass Healthy Aging Collaborative, and you'll find us. But if you click on data report, you'll see that every city and town and the neighborhoods of our 3 largest cities have their own data. So we try to make it easier for communities to take that on-ramp, as Robin put it, to join the movement. So just to kind of get into some examples and highlights, we have all of the communities that have signed up, through AARP and or the World Health Organization. But there's a very strong dementia-friendly movement in our state as well. And AARP a while back created a report called Better Together. And, that kind of lined up the age-friendly framework and the dementia-friendly framework to talk about their similarities and differences. And we took it, I would say, quite a few steps further. With, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the age and dementia-friendly integration toolkit. And that was a way to say, if you're engaged in age or dementia, or you're interested in either one, these are these different pathways to come into the movement, the ways you can engage different partners, and all of the tools and resources that are available, to all the sectors and all of the domains involved. So, you click on that toolkit and you see there's an overwhelming amount of resources and data and all kinds of things that communities can do. But again, to take it back to listening, what we tell communities is that listening to people of all ages and all backgrounds in a community, that's your filter to say, these are the resources and these are the data points that we pick out that are relevant to us, that we're going to make our action plan out of. So we have all these resources, but we say listening is the filter. You can see there's, as Antron and others have, and Robin has said, we have the first Chamber of Commerce in the country that is leading an age-friendly effort. We have our age-friendly health systems, universities, regional planning agencies have been just an immensely important partner, because we have those independent cities and towns. One of those kind of regional entities that we can rely on and go to has been regional planning agencies, and they've taken up this work, because when you think about smart growth or housing choices or transit-oriented development, they're all sort of different labels on age and dementia friendly in some way, shape, or form. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So, an important thing that we've been engaged in is embedding aging in all policies and practices. And that helps us go beyond sort of the 8 domains and find other partners that you don't typically think of when you think of healthy aging. And the president of the Tufts Health Plan Foundation has a great line that I love that says, we've been great historically at about talking about ourselves to ourselves, but who else needs to know and can benefit from knowing all of this great work and can latch on to it and strengthen what they do. So you'll see here that we do a lot with our Mass Municipal Association, the MMA. They have created age and dementia friendly as a best practice. We've included public safety and the role of first responders in being aware of how to work with and partner with people living with dementia and their care partners. We have in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the Topsfield Fair, oldest agricultural fair in the country, continuously running, and they created a dementia-friendly fair that has some kind of tips of when to visit the fair, when it's not so busy. It's really too small to see, but there's a map, a simplified route that people living with dementia and their care partners can take to still enjoy the fair, but not get overwhelmed with all the stuff that's available at the fair. But they also had just a few folks that trained, I think 200 to 300 volunteers on dementia awareness and just, how to be more patient and compassionate with people that might visit the fair. And that doesn't just work for people living with dementia, but it works for a lot of other people in the community as well. And then I also have to mention the bottom right-hand corner, why a Boston suburb combined its high school and senior center. We've been really big on the opportunities that communities have to co-locate schools and councils on aging and other facilities that serve and support older adults. And what that does is when you look at a development and you're voting on a development in your city or town, it's not just a development or a building or whatever it might be to benefit one age group, it's to benefit all ages. So even schools, we have a couple communities that are, thinking of building high schools with dedicated space for intergenerational activities, with shared use agreements that older adults can come in and be mentors. Obviously, that's not happening right now, but there's all kinds of virtual opportunities that are available to folks as well. So next slide, please. So we talked about the toolkit. We talked about the importance of, including and aligning with the dementia-friendly movement and making sure that that's, that's considered as part of age-friendly work. But what you see here on the right-hand side is our Mass Municipal Association, and that's sort of the trade group for municipal government leaders and employees. We worked with them and the Executive Office of Elder Affairs, AARP Massachusetts, and Tufts Health Plan Foundation to create sort of a guide with all kinds of examples from different communities about the movement, and the Community Compact Program, which is just a funding opportunity that we're really proud of that came from the administration with the help of Robin and the Executive Office of Elder Affairs, that adds to what we already had with the Tufts Health Plan Foundation and AARP Massachusetts and some other funding opportunities to say there's support available out there for communities to join the movement. Next slide, please. And then, kind of a rehash of a lot of what we've talked about, but we, whenever possible, integrate age and dementia friendly. We had the first city in the country that was age and dementia friendly with an age friendly health system. And again, just building on what Antron said earlier, whether you're a university or a hospital campus or whatever it might be, you're still part of the community, and there are ways that you can collaborate and work together and partner. So we're proud of how all this work kind of finds its way to each other and integrates and aligns together. Next slide, please. And so just during the pandemic, Robin mentioned the value of relationships, that you could just pick up the phone and call somebody because you had that broad-based coalition set up in a local community. But what it's led to is, different partnerships. You'll see on the bottom left-hand corner, we have plenty of councils on aging that have grab-and-go meals during the pandemic, but they have students of all levels in the community writing letters and creating uplifting artwork that they put in to the grab-and-go meals, just to let older adults in the community know that they're being thought of and they're supported. In the top left-hand corner, it's a partnership that we have going on right now with our Registry of Motor Vehicles. They created dedicated days every Wednesday in September and October to have older adults renew their licenses. And so we've been able to get elder services staff to connect them with food assistance and other supports that might be beneficial. Our grocery stores, we advocated for special hours at grocery stores and pharmacies, and that became, a mandate, and a lot of those locations signed on to that, even just independent stores. And then finally, we mentioned the Community Compact funding opportunity from the state, but there's an offshoot of that called the IT grant program. And this isn't typically used for older adults purposes, but what we're trying to encourage communities to do with this opportunity that's current is to connect affordable housing and affordable senior housing with internet access. During the pandemic, of course, this technology, as Robin said, has sort of risen right to the top with transportation and housing as one of the most important things to older adults. So this is just sort of to say, we really work hard to reframe all types of funding opportunities to show communities, whether you're looking at physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, or, really any number of issues. There's something out there that they could probably take and tweak a little bit and support their action plan, or just support older adults in the community. So that's all I have, and thank you very much for having us all.
Thank you, James, Robin, and Antron. In the few minutes we have left, I want to go over some of the questions that we've gotten from our attendees, and apologies in advance. You've had a lot of good questions, and I will guarantee I will not get all of them, but I will throw out a few of them that I think have the widest possible interest among the people here. One question that I always like to ask, and that someone asked, is what did a community learn that you shouldn't do? What were some things that came out among your process that you suddenly said, boy, we shouldn't have done this. This would have been a better thing to do instead?
Interesting. That's, it's kind of a tough one. I feel like, in our community, the communities here in Massachusetts, they all, have approached it in such different ways, which makes it difficult to say that one has identified something they did wrong. So, I think one of the misconceptions is that this age-friendly initiative is only for its older adults. And so they're only targeting just the senior population, and sometimes often the oldest seniors of that population. But, they have quickly adjusted and realized that, as James mentioned, that a lot of this initiative, it's not just doing things for your older residents, but it's for the community as a whole. Right? I always use the example of sidewalks and curb cuts. That's just not just for a senior, trying to get a walker onto the sidewalk, but for the parent pushing the stroller or the person in a wheelchair that's trying to get around the community. So, I think communities sometimes have that as the reason for doing this, but it really, when they look at it as the whole, as a whole, it benefits everyone. So just really getting that perception across.
All right. Thank you, Antron. And sort of related to that, one question came up about how did the initiative support communities with different levels of resources? I mean, you mentioned, over 300 communities in Massachusetts, 70 in the program, 60 coming in, but there's a variety of small towns versus cities, wealthy versus lower income, and even more isolation among the seniors than, say, those that have a more communal aspect.
Yeah, I can comment on that one. Robin, I see.
Go ahead.
So, I think the opportunities were offered to everyone as a whole. So, no matter what your community was, be it rural, be it very urban, the opportunities were there. ARP offered a grant program specifically each year to kind of spur at quick action items. The Tufts Health Plan Foundation also offered up funds. And then I believe at the state level, they created the Community Compact, or added an age-friendly item to the Community Compact. And I'll let Robin dive into that because I'm not too good at explaining.
Well, I think the thing I would add, Antron, thanks, is that in our state action plan, we have specifically set out as a goal that we target resources to gateway cities and to rural and isolated communities, because we were concerned that those communities either didn't have the scale, in the case of the rural communities, or didn't have the resources to approach this as other communities might. So there's been a very conscious effort here, and I think that you can see it in the philanthropic decisions that have been made to make sure that we deck resources against communities who might not have them on their own.
And because of the variety of communities that we've engaged, we have all these early examples that we can point to. So if you have a similar community, they can look to, another kind of diverse community. They can look to another rural community and see that somebody else looking like that community has done it already.
Right. And sort of getting back to sort of, how you get it from both the state level as well as the community level with administrations, what approach is effective educating the state lawmakers about age-friendly? And at the town level, how do you educate the local administration, particularly when the administration might change, every few years?
So let me start with that and have these guys add on. The easiest way to educate a lawmaker, whether it's at the state level or the local level, about why this is important, is to show them the wonderful maps that have been created through the database at UMass Boston that was funded by the Tufts Health Plan Foundation, where you can look at every single town and see that, with one exception, and that exception being Amherst, where the University of Massachusetts is, that in every single town you have more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 18. And that grabs every lawmaker, every city manager's, every mayor's attention. They had never thought about that before. And it is a conversation starter. So having the data and being able to show them who lives there in this different kind of breakdown has been critical to getting the conversations going.
And I would add that, even though the process demands municipal leadership be engaged and make that commitment and sign off on the entire process, when you get a broad-based coalition together, that ends up transcending and kind of exceeding the terms of town managers and mayors and so on. So if you're a new town official or city official coming in to power and you just get elected, there's all this momentum in the community, and it's really difficult to say, no, we're not going to do this thing that benefits people of all ages in our community, people living with dementia, community-based organizations, nonprofits, municipal departments, transportation, housing, all these different folks coming together. It's just harder to say no to a coalition. So really that's how we get sustainability locally and make it last.
All right. And more of an open-ended question, but sort of, maybe this is the soundbite question. What's the best single advice for the community who's trying to start this from scratch?
Listen to your residents, and be open to new ideas and thinking outside the box. I think we've experienced that here in Massachusetts a good bit with a number of our communities, especially when it comes to the smaller communities who say, we're never going to be able to do this, but really being encouraging and saying, no, you can do this. Doesn't matter the size of your community. Yes, no, you're not Boston, and that's what's unique about your community. So let's, how can we make it work here, and realize that you do have partners in your community that can make it happen.
And I would say pitch a very big tent. Make room for people who you wouldn't normally assume would care. It could be the shoe store, the Chamber of Commerce. It could be the local carpenters. It could be the school teachers. But some of your very best allies and most important partners will be people that you don't already work with.
Yeah, to Robin's point, that shoe store can create a walking club or an intergenerational walking club. I mean, this is how our minds work now, that whenever somebody mentions something, we can think of how it's age or dementia friendly. But be open-minded. As Antron said, we have a very diverse community in the city of Lawrence that decided to add immigration issues and country of origin as sort of a theme of their age-friendly work, because that's what mattered to folks, and people in that community take health and wellness information and civic engagement. There's just a lot that needed to be addressed in that way. So people kind of add and make up their own menu of options in communities, and not just the menu that's provided from, WHO and AARP. As Antron said, it's about listening.
Well, you've all three of us given us very much to listen to, and we want to thank you for sharing those experiences, insights with us regarding the age-friendly communities. And that concludes this portion of the sessions. Thank you all very much. I'm now going to pass both the mic and the video box to Emily Greenfield for the next session.
Hello. My name is Emily Greenfield, and I'm an associate professor of social work at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. For 5 years now, I have had the privilege of collaborating with age-friendly leaders in New Jersey to help study and support the development of age-friendly community initiatives in our state, building on the work of the great leaders in many other states, as we've learned from Massachusetts. I want to personally thank each of you for taking the time to attend this virtual conference and for your attention to this next panel titled Developing Metrics to Guide Your Work and to Show Community Improvements. As I'm sure you can appreciate from the prior presentations, devoting one's time to advancing age-friendly community change can be incredibly exciting and deeply gratifying. One reason why I find this work to be so energizing is that so many aspects of it are relatively new to the field of aging. In many ways, the people doing this work are making it up as they go along, trying new approaches that seem to make sense in their context, sharing what they learn with others, and constantly striving for the next iterative or transformative community improvement. Metrics, as things that you can count and document, are an important tool for communicating with others, as well as being honest with one's own self on both the big picture and small detail wins of your efforts, as well as areas for continued progress. But as so many of us know, metrics for evaluation are not always obvious or easy to collect, even in the best of circumstances. And this is especially the case for age-friendly community initiatives, which are inherently multifaceted, interorganizational, bottom-up and top-down, long-term, and ultimately target communities as a whole in all of their diversity, richness, and yes, messiness. Next slide. The good news is that we here in New Jersey have been working to develop strategies for evaluating age-friendly community efforts for several years now, building on the efforts of national and international leaders on age-friendly, such as AARP and the World Health Organization. And today we are able to feature some of these homegrown lessons learned and best practices on evaluation through this panel. Next slide, please. Each of the speakers on this panel will describe a different lens for evaluating age-friendly community efforts. The first presentation will showcase the evaluation of an age-friendly community initiative by gathering data with and from community residents themselves. The second presentation will use a different lens, focusing on strategies to assess the implementation of age-friendly activities, as well as the development of community capacity for age-friendly progress over time. And the third presentation will employ yet another lens, speaking to the value of evaluating a particular component or program within broader age-friendly community change efforts. So without further delay, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Beth Abbott and Sheila Brogan, who are pioneers in their collaborative leadership on behalf of Age-Friendly Ridgewood, which is an age-friendly community initiative in Bergen County. Beth and Sheila.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I on?
You're
Yeah.
good, we can hear you.
Okay, I don't know. I started my video. I don't know.
We can,
You can see me?
yes.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. We're delighted to be here speaking with you today. In Ridgewood, New Jersey, there are many advisory boards that report and give input to the Village Council. One of those is the Community Center Advisory Board, and they focus on the community center itself and the people that use it. The folks that use it are young people and older adults. So a subgroup of the Community Center Advisory Board had decided to focus on the older adults. We started designing a survey and using the AARP 8 livable community domains. During development of the survey, we used focus groups to test the clarity and flow of the questions. Next slide, please. We used SurveyMonkey for online survey responses. and we made printed copies available and offered to deliver them to anybody that phoned or emailed us asking for one. And then we had the paper copies entered into the SurveyMonkey program. Next slide, please. During the survey development, we received funding from the Henry and Marilyn Taub Foundation. And one of the huge benefits of that funding was we were able to hire an independent research firm affiliated with Montclair State to analyze the data. Their unbiased analysis added credibility to the reporting. And it's very easy in these surveys to touch on hot button issues, such as maybe new housing developments that are being discussed. So it's great to have the outside perspective, so it didn't appear that we had an agenda. We were proud of the approximate 700 responses, which was 11% of the residents 55 and older in Ridgewood. And then we used the survey data and stakeholder interviews and more focus groups to devise our initial goals and projects for age-friendly Ridgewood. Next slide, please. Then in 2019, we did a follow-up survey. It was beneficial once again to work with the firm at Montclair State, including on question design. And the second time around, we benefited from the partnerships that we had developed and the relationships, such as with our village government. So this helped with survey distribution a great deal. Next slide, please. We wondered, after 3 years of efforts, were older residents feeling more heard and considered? Some transportation ideas that we tried didn't have the impact we expected, so we wanted to learn more detail from residents. And we wanted to measure the impact of pedestrian safety improvements and gauge the need for more. Next slide, please. In our earlier survey, we learned that people wanted more age-friendly housing. We wanted to know what exactly that would look like for them. We wanted to fine-tune our communication efforts. Where should we focus? And our speaker events were popular, so we wanted to gather some ideas from residents on future topics. Next slide, please. Finally, has age-friendly Ridgewood made a difference to residents? Next slide, please. Here are some interesting demographics on who responded. The majority of respondents were in town for 20 years or more, female, married, and the average age was 70. Next slide, please. And I'd like to turn the microphone to my co-chair, Sheila Brogan.
Good morning. I should be here. Good morning. Am I coming up?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. As Beth said, when we designed the initial survey, we used AARP's 8 livable community domains. In the initial survey, affordability and a variety of housing options were the top housing issues. Older adults want to be able to age in Ridgewood, and to do this, some of our residents required affordability, and others wanted smaller, accessible housing options for downsizing. Next slide, please. In our follow-up survey, affordability as it related to the property tax was a major concern. Age-friendly, Ridgewood is an active advocate with our state legislators for continued funding for the major property tax relief programs in New Jersey. The homestead benefit and the property tax reimbursement, more commonly called the senior freeze. Funding for these programs was recently eliminated from the July 1st stopgap budget in New Jersey, but encouraging news has come to us that these programs may regain funding in October for the October 1st state budget. When asked about what types of housing would make it easier for you to stay in Ridgewood. The majority of respondents would like to see more townhomes and condominiums built, and rental apartments were the least preferred option. Next slide. In our initial survey, we asked about transportation and pedestrian safety. Regarding transportation, the request was for an expansion of a variety of transportation services. In response, Age-Friendly Ridgewood hosted 2 workshops with NJ TIP on New Jersey transit options and expanded our senior bus services. Respondents also commented on pedestrian safety and the need for improvements in our central business district. With funding from the Tao Foundation, we completed a walkability study, worked with New Jersey Future, and conducted sidewalk audits. The reports and audit findings were shared with the village, and some improvements have already been made, and there is a commitment from the village to continue making these improvements. Next slide. On our follow-up survey, we learned that only 6% of our respondents used the senior bus. Viewing this as a challenge, we worked to increase ridership with 2 bus events to bring seniors who didn't normally ride our bus to come on some special excursions. These events were well received, and we're doing pretty well with our bus, and then COVID-19 struck and our bus service stopped. So Age-Friendly Ridgewood immediately contracted with a local car service and provided rides and grocery shopping services for those who normally did ride the bus. 6 months later, the village will restart the bus service as of October 6th, and we are in the process of developing an animated video to promote the bus, giving relevant information on the service and how to reserve your seat on the senior bus. All right, next slide, please. On the follow-up survey, respondents still found the Central Business District unsafe for pedestrians and gave us a list of suggestions. And these suggestions are listed on the slide and were shared with our village government. Next slide. We know communications is key, and we were curious on how people receive their news about the village, events, and Age-Friendly Ridgewood. This slide shows some of those responses. Next slide. Since March and the COVID-19 shutdown, Age-Friendly Ridgewood has sent out newsletters every 7 to 10 days with information on services and benefits and interesting information, things to do, and they've been great newsletters. The response has been positive, readership has increased, and from the survey we have learned that people like to get information through our electronic newsletter, from our website, and through Facebook, all of which we use. Next slide. We have a strong partnership with our library and asked respondents to give us suggestions for our speaker series at the library. Listed are the responses, and you can see technology is one of them. Just last week, we did a session on scams via Zoom with the library, and we have worked with the library to give training on Zoom. So if you didn't know how to do Zoom, you could call the library, and one-on-one they would help you to navigate through Zoom. So it's been a great partnership. Next slide. Finally, we asked about the impact of Age-Friendly Ridgewood. And the good news is that 73% of our respondents are familiar with Age-Friendly Ridgewood. 70% felt Age-Friendly Ridgewood had made the community better or much better. And 45% felt that concerns about community supports and services were addressed. So that was a great track record for our first 3 years in operation. Going forward, we know there's more work to be done with pedestrian safety, housing, and transportation. And certainly we've learned a lot during the COVID-19 shutdown, so that we are more responsive in terms of grocery shopping and pickups for pharmacy pickups and things like that. The survey data has helped us identify issues, formulate our goals, and really informed our work. And so it was very helpful to have these. And that's my last slide.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Althea Peston-Stevens. She is a postdoctoral scholar at Rutgers University School of Social Work. She completed a doctoral dissertation on measuring collaboration in age-friendly initiatives in 2019 and has led research and program evaluation efforts with nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and community coalitions.
Thank you, Beth and Sheila, for telling us about how and what you learned directly from your older residents, both before and during implementation of your age-friendly initiative. So I'm working together with Dr. Emily Greenfield at Rutgers University School of Social Work, and we've been studying the initiatives that comprise the Age-Friendly Alliance of Northern New Jersey, Age-Friendly Initiatives. And we are going to be talking about how to measure that implementation, the process evaluation, in a number of different ways that you can do it within your community. Next slide, please. Could you go ahead and click until there's 4 items on there? Thank you. So there are 2 different types broadly of program evaluation, outcomes and processes. So we're probably a little bit more familiar with looking at the outcomes of something after you've done it. So what process evaluation is doing is looking at evaluating what it is that you're actually doing. Process evaluation is so important because long-term impacts can take many years to achieve and can be subtle and incremental. Process evaluation is important for demonstrating that you're doing things in the meantime before you have outcomes. This can help you not only feel accomplished and document your accomplishments along the way, but also to help you garner additional resources, such as more partners and more funding. So the first 2 items on here are a little bit more traditional. Why do process evaluation? The first one is what we sometimes call fidelity. Are you implementing your program the way that you had planned it? So that later, can you actually link what you did to the outcomes that you achieved, or to link that program that you're following to what was achieved? But some things that we've also noticed that can be really helpful from process evaluation is you can learn other things that you did along the way that may not have been planned. You can also learn which of those steps were helpful or most necessary along the way to achieving what you set out to achieve. Next slide, please. So there are 3 main approaches that we have identified for process evaluation. You can focus on activities that you're doing. You can focus on the people involved, the organizations, the stakeholders, the constituents. And you can also be community driven, which means that the activity of doing the actual evaluation is engagement in itself and more inclusive. Next slide, please. So the traditional logic model approach is what we put into the activity-centric process evaluation. You're tracking the what. So you're looking at the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact. This usually focuses on checking off when predetermined activities or goals are accomplished. You can do this iteratively. You can do this multiple times throughout the process of your program. This is typically most common among age-friendly community initiatives, and in our observations, it is most common to use administrative data. You might use Excel or a running list to track what you're doing, and then you may report monthly or periodically in some other way to your funders. You develop metrics for these along your way to specifically note who did what and when. Next slide. So here's an example of an Excel tracker that you might use to track these types of activities. The first one is the number of email blasts that you've sent out in the last 12 months. You just write down how many you did. The last one is the number of website clicks that you have in a typical month, and you would probably get this from website analytics. It's not something you'd necessarily be tracking yourself. Next slide. So now we have the people-centered approach, which is tracking the who. We also call it a network approach. It tracks the relationships with the option to also track the activities as well. This can show you which organizations are instrumental to initiative progress, as well as who might be missing from the table or not reached by age-friendly efforts. This is what we are currently in progress to do with the Northern New Jersey age-friendly initiatives. You can find some things that you can find from this type of study are the heterogeneity of the network. Does that help increase the capacity for age-friendly success? Which types of stakeholders, which types of organizations are particularly tied to success? And how does the network change over time? Does it become less siloed? Who's brokering those types of relationships? Next slide. So this is what we are doing in our current research. We're combining the network approach and the activities approach. We developed a survey of the ways in which organizations work together based on interviews we did with age-friendly initiatives over 3 years. The survey respondents then identify their organizational partners and respond to a series of questions. The respondents include the age-friendly teams and their partners to respond to which types of activities they engaged in with each partner, and then we map these out as types of relationships between organizations. The intention is that these questions and the questions we ask and the findings will be utilizable by not just for research purposes, but by the initiatives themselves for self-monitoring and reporting. Next slide. So here's an example of the type of question. The goal is to survey core teams and partners over time to see changes in the network and in ways that the individual initiatives can use the information to monitor their progress. So an example of the type of question that we would be asking includes jointly planning and implementing community events or programs, and representatives from each organization speaking or presenting at meetings or events of their other organization. So are they doing those types of activities together? Next slide. So here's an example of what an analysis might look like from a previous study that I did. Here we see this is called a sociogram. So the squares and the circles are the stakeholders, the organizations that are part of the network, and the lines are the who has the connection to who in that way. They're the relationships. So this specific question was looking at who speaks or tables at each other's programs or events. And we can see here that the local government agency in the middle is a hub in organizing the collaborative work, which documents how central that organization is. But it's also important to see who's not connected, as well as we see on the right, there's a green local government organization there too that serves as a connector, bringing other organizations into the network with this specific activity. So process evaluation in this way is helpful for identifying these patterns and relationships and identifying next steps to take. The third approach to process evaluation is more community driven. So you can use any of the methods that we've talked about already, the logic model method or the network method. You can also use more arts-based and innovative creative methods as well. But what's most important is the collaborative process in the process evaluation. Next slide. One example that we have recently learned about, which seems really promising to use in communities here, is called ripple effect mapping, which is where you use appreciative inquiry and get all of the people who have been involved or touched by the initiative in some way into a room together, into the same space, whether it's a Zoom virtual space or whether we are hopefully eventually be able to be together in person. You can do it either way. And this can be especially helpful for identifying the unintended benefits of the work and the different steps along the way that you may not have planned on doing, but do help out. So one of the examples here for the initiative that they were doing was that as a result of all of the work that the group had been doing, people ended up running for city council and getting spots on the school board, which was not something in the original plan for the initiative, but that was something that ended up happening as a result of it and along the way that impacted the success of that work that was going on. Next slide. So altogether, as Dr. Greenfield mentioned, evaluation is a challenge in the area of age-friendly communities, but it's also an exciting time because we are inventing it as a movement as we go along. Those who are just starting out can reach out to those who have been working at it to see which tools have been helpful. So we encourage people to reach out to peer initiatives and peer organizations, not just methodological experts. So thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Katie York. Dr. York is the Director of Senior Services and Lifelong Montclair for the Township of Montclair and has worked in the field of aging for over 15 years. Dr. York has overseen Montclair's Aging in Place initiative called Lifelong Montclair since 2014. She has coordinated Montclair's membership in AARP and the World Health Organization's network of age-friendly communities since 2015. Making Montclair the second community in New Jersey to join the network. Dr. York has a bachelor's degree in biology, an MBA, and a PhD in gerontology with a graduate certificate in developmental disabilities from the University of Kentucky.
Thank you, Althea. As Emily mentioned earlier, I'm going to be discussing evaluating specific programs. Next slide, please. So why should we evaluate our services? Some might argue that program evaluation is one of the most important types of research in that its purpose is to make a difference in stakeholders' lives. Some other purposes are to gather information that can be used to improve services, to guide decisions around starting, stopping, or changing a service, and to gather data to justify or augment requests for funding or reporting to funders, which is oftentimes when our hands are forced into evaluation. What program evaluation is not? It's not an academic exercise, and it's not primarily focused on building theory. It's really applied and it's on the ground. So I'd like to share a couple of real world examples. Next slide, please. The Montclair Senior Bus is a service provided by a contractor and paid for by the township. Because it is a relatively large contract, it seemed prudent to both gather data in-house as well as from the operator, Easy Ride. Some examples of the data that we track monthly are the number of rides and the change in the number of rides as compared to the beginning of the service. Next slide, please. Our Senior Bus Roundtable also put out a survey to assess rider satisfaction. So while satisfaction is not necessarily an evaluation of the effectiveness of the service itself, it certainly plays an important role in the program's sustainability. Obviously, if people don't like the rides, they're not going to continue riding, as well as the township's desire to continue funding. We want to see a high satisfaction level for the services that we are providing directly or indirectly. In this question, we asked participants to rate satisfaction across several domains, as you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. We also want to gather information that would inform us of barriers to access. So what do people see as things that are preventing them from using the bus more frequently? And you can see our findings there. Next slide, please. And by asking about destinations of choice, as you can see on this slide, we could determine where to reallocate resources should the need arise, or even what destinations to market. So for instance, we saw that there was a relatively low percentage of riders using the bus for local shopping. So we had a targeted outreach of our downtown shopping district. Next slide, please. We also use the survey to get rider feedback. So say we have this great opportunity to expand, we all of a sudden have more money. Where do we expand service? But I want to highlight here that survey data don't necessarily have to be taken alone. For example, the Senior Bus Roundtable has the expertise that if we were to expand the service area to the destinations that were suggested by the respondents in the open-ended section, the Montclair Senior Bus would essentially cover the entire county. And what would happen then? Rides would become longer, more than likely, and similarly, customer satisfaction would likely reduce. So while we saw this response, we had to also apply the expertise of the roundtable to determine next steps. Next slide, please. Lastly, the roundtable wanted to assess riders' perceptions on improved activity. So how much has their activity increased? As another indicator that might be used if funding were to be called into question. So it's another data point that we could share if the council, say, is considering canceling the contract. So we saw that more than half of riders expressed that the bus improved their level of activity, which is a solid argument for continuing funding for the bus. Next slide, please. The other vital thing about data is that they can be pulled from multiple sources to create a stronger storyline. If the question is about the bottom line, combining the data on the number of rides provided by Easy Ride with the cost of the contract, we can then determine the cost per ride. And since, like Ridgewood, we have stopped the bus service during COVID, we've used the cost per ride data to determine that operating the bus with social distancing would be less cost effective than providing facilitated Uber and Lyft rides through Easy Ride's Ride for Life. Next slide, please. A second example of program evaluation I want to share is evaluating performing arts as a possible way to reduce ageism. In this evaluation, we partnered with Montclair State University and through mental health players programming, as well as the Changing Aging Tour, we distributed surveys before and after each performing arts program with the topic of ageism. And on the left there, you can see some mental health players, and on the right, you can see some a scene from the Changing Aging Tour. Next slide, please. Our findings were that participants under 50 were more likely to view ageism as a problem, that participants were more likely to think that they can change perceptions on ageism, and that positive views on aging increased following the intervention and negative stereotypes about aging decreased. We were able to work together and publish a paper, and it was also a fantastic opportunity for an intern that we had at the time to also get a publication on her CV. So yes, while it's not always about advancing and publishing information, that's certainly on the table, and you can continue to share that innovation with others. We're now going to partner with Tufts to see if we can find the similar results with some of their programming that they have going on. And so now I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you so much to everybody for all of these insightful and well-organized remarks. I've been compiling some of the questions that have been coming up in the question and answer box as well as the chat. And I want to begin by asking the panelists as a whole to reflect on any best practices for building the connections with key stakeholders, especially the public at large, in terms of, you want that data with and from residents of the community, and especially if your age-friendly initiative is a new entity in the community and you haven't had time to develop your own database or your own kind of collection of individuals to ask to respond to questions. How have you found it helpful to kind of build that base over time, or other strategies in the meantime to use? And also, I'll tuck in the second question here. If you could think about, as you're answering that question, issues of equity and ensuring that you're engaging and hearing from subgroups of older adults who might be the least likely to come to your attention upon first pass.
Okay. I guess I can take apart for Ridgewood. When we initially started, we did one-on-one, we did focus groups with groups, but we also did one-on-one interviews and discussions with community leaders and also service providers to get a sense of where they were interacting with older adults, what they saw were the needs, and how we might work together. And that was great in terms of then helping them, getting them their help to organize focus groups and to have further discussions. So that's how we started out, and we built quite a network of partners when doing that.
I would just also add to that, that sometimes it's surprising who, becomes an ally. I think if someone personally cares about this issue, even beyond, for instance, the president of our Chamber of Commerce has been a great ally, and she didn't have to be. I think if you met a lot of Chamber of Commerces, some would and some wouldn't, but it's often just finding those people who personally are happy to be caring about this issue too.
Mhm. We made sure that we also reached and worked with Valley Hospital, that's the hospital that serves our area, and also Social Service Association that serves lower income people in our community, to make sure we didn't leave them out of the conversation. And we are very lucky that our program, one of our key members of our team is also the director of recreational services at a low-income senior housing in town. And we benefited from that partnership, and she with us. And we addressed food insecurities, and she did a fabulous job during COVID-19 and shut down, and continues to do so. But I think that was one way to do it. And we also made sure that we did outreach on property tax relief, which is a huge issue.
I think I just want to add that this is a continuous process. And so we think sometimes we thought we cast a really broad net. And then when we start looking at the names of the people who ride the senior bus, we realize there's very little overlap between them and the people who are doing our lifelong learning program. And similarly with COVID, with our food distribution program, that was a whole nother group of people that we had never touched before. So I think it's all about continuous adding of people, especially since some of the subgroups that might not be coming forth to the table are the ones that maybe are going to be harder to access. So it's all about keeping things open and realizing that you might be adding to your pool of potential participants down the road, and recognizing that this is an iterative process. This is not just, we evaluated it, we're done, everything's good.
All right. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I hear the themes of the continued importance of all these different partnerships with existing groups and organizations and key individuals, as well as this idea of really offering a wide variety of work. And I think this is part of what makes Age Friendly unique, is that it's not just about any one single program or one single issue or one subgroup of older adults or one client group of service users, for example, that it's all of this, and that there's synergies that are created and kind of like a accumulation of touch points, because you're doing all of this different aspects of this work. I want to ask a question about the resources and capacity to do evaluation. Age-friendly community initiatives can be challenged in our policy context, where there's relatively little public funding, certainly, as well as private resources to support the time and training of the people leading and doing this work. And so when you're supposed to be implementing, all these different actions as part of an action plan, and then you add on the work of doing evaluation, just wanted to ask you to reflect on, ways in which is evaluation just kind of like another thing on your list? Do you see it as kind of core to what your leadership involves? How have you found it helpful to be more efficient with your resources to ensure that you're doing evaluation activities that are really going to matter for the long-term so what of your initiative as a whole?
Well, Beth, you want to talk? You want to go?
Sure. Julia told me to speak louder. That's the first time somebody's told me to speak louder. So I think I have a personal bias, obviously, towards thinking about evaluation. So it's important to me personally, but I will say it's one of those things that seems to be like marketing is the other thing, that it's like we're doing all the stuff and it's one of the things that kind of just seems secondary and falls by the wayside. So what I've tried to do is be intentional in the beginning in figuring out how I'm going to evaluate things. I think that helps kind of divvy up the work. And I'm fortunate that a lot of our members of our Senior Citizens Advisory Committee also value evaluation. And so sometimes they'll take on the burden of surveying the community and things like that. So in every community, there are data nerds. So even if you can recruit some of them to help out in a volunteer capacity, that's always good, because there's going to be some point where you're going to have to justify your work or the costs that it's taking to do your work, whether it be program specific or much more broadly. So any points that you can have in your quiver that support the value of the work that you're doing, it's good information to have.
And I think I would like to add that, you know, some communities might use their initial funding, if they're lucky enough to be able to get initial funding, to pay a consultant to do a needs assessment. But what we've seen is that it can be really helpful to maybe have someone as a true consultant, not someone who's doing the entire needs assessment for you, but is maybe helping guide you through doing that initial needs assessment. Or maybe you can even, I know this is definitely would come from a place of privilege, if there are people in your community who you realize are maybe retired statisticians, retired researchers, or people who just have skills or interest in that area as well. Because it's really an opportunity to build that capacity within your community to be able to have those evaluation skills moving forward, so that maybe you get a little bit of help doing your initial needs assessment, but then later on, when you want to be able to do follow-up surveys, when you want to be able to do outcome studies, you have those skills inside your community and you're able to do that. You're empowered to be able to do that.
I think that the other thing is that evaluations can help you to keep on track. And, you know, what are the important things? What are those outcomes that the community, you know, and it's that listening, you know, what is it that the community needs and wants, and where can we help? And as it's been stated, you know, as we improve the community for older adults, we're really making the community better for everybody who lives here. So that listening part is really important, and I think the evaluations help us to listen better.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think that's about it for the time we have for this panel, so I'm going to hand the mic back over to Jeff or Rini to close us out.
So I want to thank all of our speakers. Thank you to our Massachusetts speakers who inspire us to pursue bold aspirational goals, to expand the number of towns and cities to join the network, to listen to community members as filters and as guides, and to convene a broad swath of likely and unlikely organizations to be a part of our age-friendly work. I want to thank our New Jersey panelists, Emily, Sheila, Beth, Althea, and Katie. You offered helpful guidance of ways to measure our work. You showed us how this work includes very broad partnerships as well to address very tough issues. And you highlighted the use of metrics to drive decisions and tell stories. I want to encourage all of you to join us for our next session. We hope to see you next week. This will be a Zoom meeting, which will enable breakouts and interactive conversations about partnerships and its power in age-friendly work. When you leave, please complete the survey that will pop up on your screen when you log out of this conference. We hope you have a safe and successful day, and thank you again for joining us.